Before I do so, just so you know, I'm also running the Angular certification program, which also has React and JavaScript, Vue, Laravel, and Next. And for the conference, there's a specific offer. You can use the coupon Devoxx26, and you get $25 off any certification. I do have stickers and stuff down here too. So if you want stickers and little things, it's all down the stage right there. And now we can get started. So what is React, right? We're going to start with React. React is a JavaScript library used to build web applications. It's designed to be lightweight and simple to understand, meaning you can learn React quickly. There's a few concepts to know about, and it's definitely super lightweight. Compared to starting with Angular, you can start with React with just a few lines of code and just one or two dependencies. Now, React is not a framework, meaning that it's lightweight, of course, but that's because there's not much in it. You don't have all of the stuff you will have in Angular, and we're going to talk about that very soon. The thing is, of course, you can still do a lot of things with React, but it requires you to know about third-party libraries. So you have to go shopping on NPM and figure out, oh, what do I use for my forms? What do I use for HTTP? What do I use for state management? And all of these are extra decisions you have to make. Now, React comes from Meta, Facebook. And it's definitely a favorite of Silicon Valley. So all companies, well, not all, most companies in Silicon Valley use React. So that's Netflix, Uber, Twitter, Airbnb, Pinterest, Instagram, and more. Now, Angular, on the other hand, comes from Google, right? And it's more on the enterprise side of things. So who uses Angular? It's going to be banks. It's going to be insurance companies. It's going to be government, the army, airlines, all of the big stuff. Who came here by taking an airplane? Who flew to Athens for this conference? Quite a few people. You should check the website of your airline. I can bet it's an Angular website. Pretty much sure. Because so many of them are made with Angular. So yeah, these are like the differences side by side. React comes from Facebook, Angular comes from Google. Both are about components. React is a library, Angular is a framework. React focuses on just a view, so just being all about components, where Angular is really a framework with modules and a lot more things that come out of the box, like a component router, an HTTP client, different ways to handle forms. We use TypeScript with Angular by default. With React, it's optional. Usually, by default, it will be JavaScript, ES6 plus JavaScript, but you can also use React with TypeScript because as it was a good idea from Angular, React said, OK, we have to support TypeScript as well. It says Angular uses Webpack. That's not true anymore. Now we use Vite, and React does similar stuff. So again, lots of similarities. The few differences really are on the framework versus library side of things. Now let's get into syntax. So both Angular and React, they are all about components. So if you know how to create a component in Angular, you would do exactly the same thing in React and create a component. So here on the left, we have an Angular component. And on the right, we have an equivalent React component. So Angular, React. What are the similarities and differences? Well, here it's very, very similar, right? Angular has a class and a decorator to tell us that it is a component. React is just a function. And the name of the function in React is what's going to serve as the selector, right? So when you want to display that component, you would use Jumbotron in React, which in Angular, we have a selector for now, because the Angular team was thinking about removing that and doing it just like React, meaning not having a selector anymore in our Angular component, but instead using the name of the class. So we'll see. Maybe this is going to happen at some point, but if they do that, then it's almost exactly the same. at least on that example, because I'm not doing anything. It's just HTML. So of course, there's not a lot of differences here. So in Angular, we have this template syntax that we use in our templates. And React is doing something different. They use something called JSX. And the idea of JSX is that it is just like an HTML syntax, but that actually gets turned into JavaScript. So if you look at my React example here, what I return is not a string. There's no backticks or double quotes or anything. It's just HTML code within my JavaScript. So that's JSX. And it's part of the magic of what React does. So JSX is a separate library from React, but it kind of gives you this impression that you bring your HTML inside your JavaScript. And as a result, you can pretty much use any JavaScript you want inside JSX. So that's one of the big differences, at least under the hood, because again, from a syntax standpoint, at this point, it's just the same. React can use classes as well. It used to be the default a few years ago, and then they switched everything to functions. And now they still support both, I think, in theory, but they removed all the class stuff from the documentation, and they say just use functions instead. That said, not that long ago, you could use a class in React as well. It would have to extend a React component. It would have to have a render method that returns that JSX template. But other than that, so yeah, that's the function version on the right. This is the class version. So very, very similar. Component communication. How do we pass information to a component in Angular? We use inputs, right? So we have inputs, we have outputs, and then if we want to display data in our templates, we would use expressions with a double curly braces. In React, these inputs, outputs, they are called props. And they work exactly the same. You would pass them as HTML attributes, HTML parameters. You would receive them as a function parameter, those props, and then you can use them in your templates using expressions. The expressions in JSX have only one curly brace, not two. So that's a massive simplification, right? Big savings. But yeah, other than that, it's exactly the same thing. Again, same concept. Now, one difference in React is that props are used for both inputs and outputs. You can pass anything into them. And so if you want an output, you would pass a function that acts as a callback. And then you would call that function from your React code, which is going to call that function from the parent component. So you're passing references to functions when you want an output. That's one difference with the Angular syntax and the Angular way of doing things. Can React use TypeScript? Yes, you can do that. Not by default, you will have to do some extra setup, but the idea then remains very, very similar. So you can type your props, which is one of the main benefits of using TypeScript, because in the previous version, you have a props object, but you have no idea what are these inputs and outputs, right? They could be anything. So with TypeScript, you get extra type information. For props, very useful. You know what to expect as inputs and outputs, well, in and out of the props. So yeah, we can do that with TypeScript, with React. Template syntax. So that's where things differ a little bit more. Now in Angular, we have a very nice control flow with blocks. So we have if block, for, switch, all of that, which makes the syntax nice and easy to read. You can have indentation. It's pretty clean, I think. Whereas React relies on JavaScript tricks, basically, to do all of this. So the equivalent of, and all of this code, so what I show on the left is the Angular syntax, on the right is the exact equivalent in React. And so you can see that the if condition in React is a little bit trickier. Well, it's JavaScript's knowledge that you need to have. So it uses the double question mark operator to say, hey, if this exists, then do this. Otherwise, displays something else, which in that case is nothing. And for loops in React, the main syntax is to use a map function. So you have an array of things. You use the map JavaScript array function to generate a bunch of JSX elements, right? Which is what we do here. So React enforced that you need to have a key on everything that you repeat. So here we have key equals index. And well, Angular decided to do the same and enforce that when we have a for loop, we have to track by something as well with a unique, tracking value. So, and that's a common theme when you switch to React. It requires you to be a lot deeper in JavaScript, have more JavaScript knowledge than as an Angular developer. I've seen teams of backend developers get into Angular easily, like from Java or C#. Getting into Angular was easy, even if they didn't know JavaScript too well. And that's because Angular has all of these syntaxes that are easy to learn and understand, and that don't require you to be really, really good in JavaScript. React is the opposite. With React, they assume that you are a very good JavaScript developer, and you already know about all of these operators, all of these array functions and tips and tricks. So that's, from a learning perspective, that's one of the key points that can help make the decision. Is my team already good with JavaScript, or are they beginners? If they're beginners, Angular is going to be much easier to adopt and use, and React is going to be a little bit steeper because you have to get deep into JavaScript first. So that's controller flow. Component state and change detection. So with Angular, we have different options. So here in my component, I have two properties. One of them is just a variable, a number, and the other one is a signal. So I store a value in a signal, and then I would display this in my template. With React, everything that is reactive, meaning if the value changes, you have to re-render the component, has to be in either props or state. And in order to use state in React, you have to use this useState function. So the useState function, you can see it kind of like a signal in a sense. It's different, but it has similarities. And there was a joke in the Angular community when the signal function came out. People asked, why don't you call it useState instead? Because it's kind of the same idea. You're bringing a library or framework feature to your component to make it reactive and aware of state changes. So useState in React, there's this interesting syntax, right? Because a useState returns an array, and that array has two things. The first thing is the value, the current value of that variable in your state. And the second item in the array is a setter to change that value. So that's why we do this array destructuring in React. Again, requires more JavaScript knowledge than the basics to know about array destructuring and that kind of thing. React always relies on JavaScript tips and tricks like this. But yeah, other than that, it's similar. So that useState, if I wanted to change the value of my price, I would have to call setPrice and a new value. And by using that setPrice, I'm basically notifying React that the component is changing its state. And so the component is going to re-render. So Angular is somewhat similar. So now with zoneless in Angular, using signals is a new recommended way because that's the way to make sure that when the value changes, Angular knows exactly which components have to be updated. And yeah, in a zoneless world, Angular also reacts to async pipe updates, input value changes, and manual change detection triggering. So with Angular, you have more options to control change detection, really, whereas React, it's going to be that useState, so state changes or props changes. Now, the funny thing with React is that in terms of rendering components, it works completely differently from Angular. The main thing to remember about React is that it has this notion of virtual DOM. And what that means is that when there's a change, React is going to render the DOM in memory. So that's what they call virtual DOM. And then it's going to compare that virtual DOM in memory with what's currently on the screen. And if there's any difference between the two, it's going to apply that diff from the virtual DOM to the real DOM. So it's never trying to be smart about, oh, this is the part that changes. I'm just going to update the DOM here. It's just re-rendering everything and then doing a comparison and then applying patches, right? Whereas Angular, the code that you compile with Angular has very precise instructions on how to display the div tag, the h2 tag, the expressions in the middle. And so if you change the expression, Angular can just do a set of that new expression right there. So Angular has JavaScript instructions to know how to render and update everything in your templates. React doesn't do that. React just re-renders everything and does an in-memory comparison and then patches what changes. So I'll show you a demo here. Let's see if that works, considering it's not my computer anymore that I'm using for this, so we'll see. So this is a very basic React component. And for a very long time, this was a big argument for React, that you can just write 5 or 10 lines of code and have something up and running, whereas Angular needed an app module and an app component and all of this stuff. Now, Angular is very much down to the same kind of thing with standalone components. So here we have a function, and this function, it is a component. So it returns some JSX, and it's going to render it. Basically, in React, any function that returns some JSX can be used as a component, right? That's the main criteria. If you return some JSX, then you are a component. And so in this example, what I do is I call that function every second. So I'm calling a function, hello world, it is today's date, and I'm doing this every second. So what we would think is that because I'm doing this every second and I'm rendering that entire element every second, what would happen is this div gets destroyed and replaced with a new one every second, right? That would be the assumption, because we're basically saying redo the same process every second. But no, if I run this, and if we look at the dev tools, inspect, we'll see that the only part that's going to change is going to be my date. So going here, and yeah, you can see that the only part that's blinking every second is the time in that example. Even though I'm re-rendering the entire, I'm calling that function every second, right? So it doesn't, even if we say render all of this, React is going to do this virtual DOM thing, render it in memory, compare, apply a patch to the HTML. And that's part of the magic of React, right? The first time you see React, it's like, oh, that's very smart. That's pretty good. And yeah, it is really good at that, and it does make React interesting and performant. So that's change detection for React, at least. And so now, so yeah, this virtual DOM, it's basically what I just said. It's an in-memory representation of the DOM, known as the virtual DOM. React is creating a diff before, after your changes, applying incremental changes in the browser. So only the portions of the UI that need to be re-rendered actually get re-rendered. Okay, now initializing a component. So in Angular, we have different ways to initialize things. You can use the property initialization in your component. You can use the constructor. You can use ng-on-init. You have different ways to initialize something. In React, though, it's different, because React uses functions. And as we saw, these functions are meant to run over and over and over again, which means if you have an initialization task in the middle of a function, this is going to re-render at every refresh of the component. So because of that, React had to find tricks so that there are things that we do only once and not all the time at each re-render. And one of these tricks is to use another hook. So the useState function we saw earlier, this is called a hook in React. There's also a use effect. And use effect is a way to wrap some code that's going to run at some sometimes in your life cycle based on some syntax options. So this use effect here is going to initialize, so make a request to a server, get some data, and do your initialization, then updating the state. As we see, we do a set title. That set title is from use state, so it's going to update the state of the component and re-render it. So this use effect here is going to run only once. Do you know why? Do we have React people here who know why? Yeah? Yes. So because the second parameter of use effect, see, there's use effect takes a function as a param, and the second parameter down here is an empty array. And because that array is empty, it means it's going to run only once. That's obvious, right? If the array is empty, you just run once. Well, the thing is, this array is actually a good idea. It's an array of dependencies. And if you list props in here or state variables in here, when they change, it's going to tell React to rerun that effect again. So you can define the dependencies that would trigger that effect to run again. So in Angular, we would do ng on changes, for instance, or ng on init. Or, well, ng on changes, if an input changes, you want to run some request to fetch some data based on that new input. Yeah, mixing the two now. They are the same thing. But you get a new input, you want to run a request again, you would use ng on changes in Angular. With React, you can do use effect, list your prop as a dependency in that array, and that would do exactly the same thing. When the prop changes, this specific effect would run again, which means in the React component, it's very typical to have more than one use effect. You could have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 based on so this one is the equivalent of an ng on init, right? In a sense, it's going to run just once because it doesn't have any dependency. The array of dependencies is empty. Services versus custom hooks. So this is where the comparisons between Angular and React become a little bit more blurry or less obvious, I would say, because when we use Angular, we have dependency injection. So if I need something to do some business logic, I would inject a service. The service knows how to do things. I use it. With React, there's no real notion of service, but the closest equivalent I could think of is that you can create custom hooks. So there are hooks from React, like use state and use effect, but you can create your own hook that's going to bring dependencies and custom code into your component. So in this example, I'm using a use cart hook, which is a function that returns something. And that's really completely up to you what that something is. It could be a service, like a class with methods. It could be just a variable. It could be a combination of all of that. And in this example, I'm returning an array. So using the same common React pattern of returning arrays from hooks. And that array is using destructuring to get the cart contents. So yeah, React doesn't have services or dependency injection, but custom hooks kind of do the same. There are major differences, though. When you use an Angular service, by default, if that service is provided in root, you have only one service for the entire application, which is convenient, right? Because you can store info in that service, and then it's shared between all of your components. So you can use your service as a cache or as your state storage, basically, and then share everything with all components. In React, when I use a hook like this, it's not what's happening. It's creating one new instance of that hook. It's going to run that function for that component. If another component does it, it's going to get its own separate implementation. So you can't use the hook to share data the same way you would with Angular, basically. There are ways to do that, but it's not automatic like it is in Angular. They're not singletons, basically. Routing. So routing in Angular, you have a router that's part of the framework. You create your path config. You map them to components, pretty straightforward. React doesn't have routing by default. The library doesn't have a router. and React itself doesn't implement any router. So the library doesn't have any solution for that. You have to rely on third-party libraries, and there's quite a few different ones. Now, the thing is, they all do similar stuff. And so the syntax, as you can see here, is not that different. You have a path, you map it to an element, which would be a component or some JSX. So here it's just a div because, yeah, you can use JSX everywhere in React. And then in Angular, we would have a router outlet. And in React, typically, well, it's going to depend on the router implementation you take, and even the same router libraries can have different ways to do that. Typically, you would have some sort of HTML, JSX elements that decides where the component gets rendered with that router. So here, a router provider and mapping that router in my DOM. So what React doesn't do out of the box, we saw that routing is one of these things. There's no two-way data binding in React either, right? So you don't have ng model, you don't have these two-way bindings. You basically have to figure out your own way to do that using inputs and outputs or other mechanisms. So no services or dependency injection, no built-in form management. That's a big thing too, right? You don't have template-driven forms, reactive forms, or signal forms. You have to rely, you either do it manually pretty much, or rely on third-party libraries. And there's a ton of them you have to choose from. No router, no lazy loading. That's kind of changing a little bit maybe. Something I didn't list here is that both Angular and React now have options for server-side rendering as well. But yeah, the thing is always the same. Angular is a framework, so it comes with a lot of things built in, router, forms, state management to some extent, dependency injection and all that. And React, well, you just have to know the right NPM dependencies to use. And the thing about this is that working with Angular tends to be more comfortable because if there's a big change in Angular, the Angular CLI is going to have a migration for it, right? We're going to get a migration, run a command, and it's just going to update the syntax for us. With React, you'll typically rely on 10, 15 different dependencies for your routing, for your forms, for your state management, and all of these, they evolve at a different speed. And they don't have a CLI to automatically update and change your code. So from a maintenance perspective, it's trickier. You basically have to be on top of things and check and do the updates and all of that, which to me is one of the reasons why Angular is more on the enterprise side of things, more stability, more support from Google and the CLI to do these automatic updates. Whereas with React, you have to be more proactive and do it yourself, right? That's really what it is. So yeah, React or Angular, basically, if you have to decide, what would be the criteria for decision? If you like freedom and you're very good in JavaScript and you have a small team where communication is not an issue, then React is a good idea, right? People very strong in JavaScript, small teams, they want to iterate quickly, all of that, they can get things done with React. That works. But the thing is, I think it's more difficult to scale React. It requires more discipline, right? There's no guardrails like what you have in Angular. It's also more difficult to jump from one React project to another because the decisions made in one project might be very different in a different one. And so when you get into a new React project written by somebody else, you pretty much have to restart from scratch and figure out how did they do this, how did they do that, which libraries did they use, all of that stuff. Angular is a lot more opinionated, right? If you work with several Angular projects, when you jump from one to the other, it's very, very close. You find the same structure, you find the same naming conventions, all of that is already defined by the framework. So it's just safer and a lot easier to move from one thing to the other. You get more features out of the box, but also less freedom, right? So it's really something to take into account. And I would say it's not even a technical decision. It's more of a people decision. What's the background of my team? Or even the company that you're working in? Are we agile and we can adapt quickly to changes and react and update dependencies and move on? Or do we move in a slower pace and we don't want to change everything every few months, or we want a constant architecture that is not going to be much different 5 years from now? In that case, Angular, of course, is a more stable bet, I would say. So yeah, Angular repos are consistent in terms of structure and style. React, typically not. If you're very good with JavaScript, know about lots of stable JS libraries. You'll be good with React. Otherwise, you're going to suffer quite a bit, and you'll have to play the NPM roulette of, I need form management. Which one looks good? Or ask ChatGPT, what should I use for my forms? I guess that can work, but you can also get surprises. But yeah, I would say that Angular is a lot easier to get into, which is counterintuitive because people would tell you it's React that's easier to learn. But the basics are easier to learn. But once you know the basics, when you want to build real stuff, then Angular becomes a lot more easier on you, gives you more, not options, but gives you more guidance, gives you a path to do something. Whereas with React, we're going to tell you, oh no, we don't have any opinion. Do anything you want. Do it any way you want. But when you get started, that's just overwhelming in terms of decisions to make. Yeah, just a reminder about the certification stuff that I talked about in intro. If you're into that, you can ask me questions after the talk. I'll be happy to answer them. And that's everything I had. I have the link to my slides here, the link to my blog, my newsletter. And if you have any questions, do we have any time left with the delay and everything? Make it outside with the Q&A because... Okay, so Q&A is going to be after outside the room. So if you want to ask me questions, just catch me outside and I'll be here to answer questions. I still have stickers and stuff down here, so feel free to come grab any of those. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming today.